Alright, hey guys, IDSG here, and welcome to the 6th episode of How to Use, the series in which I teach you guys how to use every single item in the Hypixel Bedwars shop. And in this video, we are covering the sponge and all the things you can do with it. If you guys enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to vote in the comments on what item you want me to cover next in 2 weeks. Your remaining choices are the Gapple, the TNT, the Ender Pearl, the Bridge Egg, and the Magic Milk. So yeah, vote on those in the comments down below, and yeah, let's get on with the video. Alright, so welcome to How to Use the Sponge, and if you're new to this series or just my channel in general, then I go over the same food categories every single time. So first, I go into a brief overview of the item. I then go into what this item pairs well with, and blocks are always a given for that section. I then talk about the different tactics you can use with this item, whether offensive, defensive, or evasive. I go into the ideal placement of the item if it's a placeable item. I then go into what game modes it works well in, the necessity of the item, and lastly, I give a overall rating of the item at the very end. Okay, so first I want to give a brief overview of the sponge. It's a item found in the utility section and is the sponge icon. It costs 3 gold in solos and doubles and 6 gold in 3s and 4s. Its lure is great for soaking up water. So what does this item pair well with? It doesn't pair exceptionally well with anything other than blocks, but doesn't pair well with water at all. Let's go into the offensive tactics you can use with this item. And if you're in the middle of a 1v1, a common strategy many players use to get an extra hit in to potentially start a combo is to build a small barricade to block your opponent's line of sight where their head is looking. This may come in the form of a small staircase, a sideways L shape, etc. And it is very effective, especially against opponents who don't see it coming. In the case of the sponge, it adds in another surprise factor when you place it down and when it disappears. Many players will instinctively aim for the top of the blockade, especially if it's a staircase, so when the sponge disappears, you are more likely to get the first combo in since their crosshair will most likely be off target. I find that this works best with the staircase kind of barricade that goes up 3 steps since it forces your opponent's crosshair to aim up higher, meaning that it takes longer for them to readjust when the sponge disappears. Another thing you can do if you're facing a team with the bed defense covered in water is to use the sponge to easily soak up the water for at least 3 seconds without having to go up to where the source block is and blocking it off. If the source block is just above their bed though, the sponge will likely get rid of it entirely as long as you place it at least 4 blocks away or so from the source. This makes your job a lot easier when dealing with these kinds of bed defenses and completely avoids the potential situations in which your rush may go wrong. Examples being getting comboed while trying to get block off the water, having to sit there for way too long while waiting for the water to come down, etc, etc. Even if the water source is high up, the sponge gives you enough time to burrow into your opponent's bed defense and block yourself up as long as you aren't interrupted during the process. Also, a little pro tip here is to take only 1 sponge at a time for each rush so you don't lose all your sponge and have to buy another set. Keep the rest in your e-chest or your team chest so you have a total of 4 rushes before having to buy another set. The last offensive tactic I want to talk about is if you're in the middle of a 1v1, you potentially use a sponge as a smoke screen to give yourself an edge in the fight by lowering your opponent's frame rate and confusing them. However, do not expect your opponent to be unable to track you at all once the smoke is in effect. You should also keep in mind that they may not have smoke particles on, which makes the entire point of the strategy pointless. This doesn't mean that there aren't times when it could work. Some players still have that particle effect on, and it will certainly at least confuse them a bit when you place that down. So I'd say if you have sponges on you, use them for that off chance that they have the particle effect on. Turning the smoke particle effect off for yourself is a wise idea if you do plan to do this or counter it. Now let's go into the defensive tactics. If you know that your opponent has a TNT and know exactly where they are dropping it, what you can do is have a teammate stack up right under the block you think they're going to drop it from before they place it, and then you or another teammate place a 3 of the 4 sponge at least 3 blocks above your bed defense when they place it. This makes it so that the TNT should then not be able to penetrate the bed defense. This also makes it so that your bed defense stays intact without a mess above it, unlike if you used ordinary blocks or a pop-up tower to catch a TNT. However, sponges cost gold as opposed to iron, and water can do the exact same thing, but better since it's less prediction reliant and costs the same amount. If you don't want to mess though, the sponge are definitely the way to go. Okay, so for this next tactic, this is more seed in 3s and 4s than in solos or doubles, but I talked about it in the how to use water post that I made about 2 months ago. Essentially, the tactic was to get high above your opponent's bed defense and pour down water onto your opponent's bed defense. If you're on the receiving end of this tactic, you counter this by building up directly below the platform where the water source is, and once you get within reaching distance of the bottom of the platform, which is about 5 blocks under, you can place down the sponge to immediately draw up their water source and hopefully ruin their attack plan. Be careful when stacking up though, since your opponents can be intelligent, unbelievable, I know, and attempt to knock you off while you build up to them. So be sure to bring ladders or a water bucket to break your fall if they manage to hit you off. Alright, so for evasive tactics, if you're backed into a corner or just want to create some space between you and your opponent, what you can do is place sponges down below you as you run to create a massive smoke screen and then hide behind a corner or something, hoping that your opponent doesn't see where you went. You can combine this with invis too, so that you can completely bamboozle your opponent and make an even better getaway. Be warned that if your opponent has smoke particles turned off, it makes this completely ineffective and you will likely have to resort to other means in order to get away. Another thing you can do with the sponge is use it to cross gaps to get away from your opponents without them being able to follow behind you easily. What I mean is, sometimes you really need to create some considerable space between you and your opponents chasing you because you need to buy items from a shopkeeper or whatever. This is where the sponge comes in. If you have a decent lead in your opponents, like they're 15 blocks behind you, and you have some sponges with you, what you can do is start building off into the void towards where you'd like to go with the sponge, and then use normal blocks whenever you run out of sponges so they don't fall into the void. For crossing small gaps, having even just 4 is likely enough to get you at least within block cushion distance of where you'd like to go. But if you want to cross larger gaps, like from base to diamond gen, etc., you need at least 16 to create a large enough gap to where your opponents have to take a considerable amount of time to get to you by building. Be warned that your opponents can buy fireballs to pursue you, so be mindful of that, especially in the late game, and be ready with a backup plan in case they do have fireballs and you are going to use this tactic. I suggest getting an ender pearl or pop-up towers if you don't have emeralds, so that you can either escape by pearl clutching if you do get fireball, or attempt to block the fireball by placing a pop-up tower in front of where that fireball is headed. Buying a bow is also not a bad idea if you think you can react in time to shoot the fireball back. This makes it so you at least have a chance of survival if things go south. Also, fun fact, you also don't need to know how to speed bridge to actually bridge with sponges. Lastly, if you're in a situation in which you really need to get out and go, what you can do if you have a decent amount of space between you and your opponent is build up with sponges and then use normal blocks to build yourself a bridge or a platform, depending on which one you need the most in the moment. Combine this as a jump potion, you go up really high over the sponges, and your opponents won't be able to do a thing about it except slowly build up to you, since they can't place ladders fast enough to climb up the sponges before they disappear. Alright, now let's get into the ideal placement of the item. On offense, when trying to block your opponent's line of sight, place 2 sponges on top of one another in front of your opponent, and then place the rest of the sponges on the left or right of the top sponge, all in a line to create the sideways L-shaped barricade, and then place a block below you to get over the barricade to stab your opponent. If you want to do the staircase, place 2 or 3 sponges on top of one another, depending on how much you bought, in front of your opponent, and then place another one below you if you only place 2 sponges so far. If you're doing a 3-step staircase, back up 2 blocks after creating the stack of 3 sponges, and then place 2 sponges in front of the bottom sponge, and lastly place a sponge against the front of the second sponge on the original stack of 3 sponges. To get rid of water on opposing bed defenses, place a sponge on the corner of your opponent's bed defense. The closer the water source, the better. But if you know that it's not worth it to get rid of the source because it's too high up or something, just place it down near where you want to break in on that corner. To create a smoke screen in a fight, place it next to you or your opponent in the middle of a fight so that it covers both of you. Placing the L shape or something similar in the middle of the fight to block your line of sight will also have the same effect. On defense, to catch a TNT, once you have a tower stack, place 3 sponge under the TNT as it drops down so that it causes minimal damage to your bed defense. To counter water being poured down onto your bed defense or into your forge room, if it's poured down on top of your bed defense, build up and place the sponge directly below the platform where the water is to soak it up. If it's spewing into your forge room and you want to get out, buy a sponge and place it down as soon as you get past the point where you can place down blocks, so your team don't have to suffer for a bit. And then quickly place down another one in your source block, preferably within the time span of the first sponge that was placed. If your opponents are waiting outside or in with you, knock them out of the way first. Then place down the sponge and escape as fast as you can once you're outside the front door of your forge room. So what game modes does it work well in? It works well in all game modes, but I feel that it's more viable in solos because there are less players. You won't have to deal with a scenario where you are trying to escape to another island and you get fireballed from 2 directions at once, and and they are half the cost there as opposed to 3s and 4s where they cost 6 gold. Now, as for the necessity of this item in solos and doubles, buying sponge in the early game is very inconsistent. Although you may have the surprise factor, the sponge is not so overwhelming that it will win you every single encounter. I'd suggest going with buying a TNT or a water bucket if a team is already rushing you, since those produce more consistent results than the sponge. Later in the game, when you have a decent amount of gold though, it's not a completely terrible idea to buy a set of sponges that will win you that one fight that you need to win in order to get an opposing team's bed. In 3s and 4s, buying sponge early game can actually be effective if you're good at PvP and know exactly what you're doing. Water bed defenses are common amongst the casual players there, and the offensive water tactic is also common amongst the more competitive scene there too. So there's actually a decent amount of reasons why you should get sponges in those game modes, but its price tag makes it only really worth it for the average player in the mid or late game when you have a decent amount of gold lying around to spend. Now overall, this item is actually a lot better than you think it'd be in some fairly common situations. If you use it correctly and use its quirks to your advantage, you can do some really neat stuff with it and pull out victorious even in tough situations. Its only con that it's a bit too expensive for the small amount of sponges that it provides, especially in 3s and 4s. I understand this item was originally added to counter water, which explains why they share the same price tag in both game modes, but for it to have a true place in the meta, there needs to be a lot more bang for your buck for each purchase. Maybe around 6 or 8 sponges for 3 gold in solos and doubles and 5 gold in 3s and 4s could make this better. Alright, so that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to leave a comment for the next how to use video in 2 weeks, and if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe and share it with all your friends. And yeah, that's all gaming, guys. Peace out.